with the people of Oklahoma. As the distinguished senator from Oklahoma knows, I have a strong connection with Oklahoma. My mom grew up on a farm in picking cotton in Oklahoma, and we've talked before about my grandparents until they passed away being there, and it was a wonderful trip for my family to go every summer to Oklahoma, Ponca City in later years with my grandparents to visit every summer. And I'll never forget that in the backyard my grandparents had a tornado shelter, basically. It was on a little mound of dirt, and you opened up the door. It looked just like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, opening the door and going down into the cellar. And we've had a couple of times when in the middle of the night we had to get up and go use the cellar, and I know how frightening that was for me as a child to experience that. And I know that the storms have just gotten more and more and more intense with more and more devastation, and we all hope for the very, very best in the recovery for all the families involved.
And I do recall you're talking about your years and your family, your background in Oklahoma. The only thing I disagree with is we've always had these. Really, statistics show they're not getting more intense and not getting worse. They're just bad. I mean, the people are, and the storm shelters that you're talking, that the gentlelady from Michigan is talking about, you drive through Oklahoma in the rural areas, everybody's got those. We dug them, and because we've been used to that for many, many years. Now the major difference here is in the major cities, or the cities, they don't have them like they do. I'd say 95% of them in the rural areas do, but the ones in the cities, maybe a half of 1%. So that's going to be getting some attention from us. And I thank you for your remarks.
Thank you very much. Madam President, I do rise in opposition to the amendment. I appreciate the concerns raised by the senator, but I rise in strong opposition to block granting and cutting the food assistance program called SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for our country. I have always viewed, as chair of the Agriculture Committee, two programs very similarly. One, crop insurance that's there when there's a disaster for a farmer, and SNAP, or the Food Assistance Program, which is there when there's a disaster for a family. They both go up when the disasters go up. They both go up in cost. They go down when things get better. So when we have droughts, when we have what we've had happening to our farmers over the last year and before, we see costs go up for crop insurance. We don't cap that arbitrarily, saying we don't like these droughts, we don't like these freezes, we don't like all this stuff, so even though it's real for the farmers, we're just going to cap how much will help them. Crop insurance is there. Same thing is true for a family. It wasn't that long ago, in fact, the beginning of 2009, when we in Michigan had the highest unemployment rate in the country. I believe it hit 15.7% unemployment at that time. We had an awful lot of people at that time, and many that have continued, although things are getting a lot better, who paid taxes all their lives, never thought in their wildest dreams they would ever need help putting food on the table for their families. But they did. And it's temporary. The average length of time that someone needs help is 10 months. But I consider that to be a point of pride for our country, that we have a value system that says we're going to make sure when families are hit on hard times through no fault of their own, that they're not going to starve, that they're going to be able to put food on the table for their children. I think that's the best about us. And now that things are getting better and the unemployment rate is coming down, the cost of these programs is coming down. Our Farm Bill shows a cut in spending, not because we've decided we're only going to help some people and not other people, some children, not other children, but because people are going back to work. They don't need the help anymore. So we are seeing those lines go down. By the way, as crop insurance goes up, because disasters on weather have gone up, we're seeing family disasters going down, which is where we want it to go. But unfortunately, this amendment would cap the amount of help that we would give on supplemental nutrition, would cap it for 2014 at just over half of the current levels. So we would say, we don't care how many families have a problem. We don't care what happens. We don't care what happens because of weather that wipes out a business and suddenly folks who've worked hard all their lives find they need some help that they never thought that they would need. This would arbitrarily cap at just over half the current levels needed to maintain the current help. It would mean absolutely devastating results for millions of families that are trying to feed their children. And if you consider the fact that about 47% of those who get help right now are children, almost half of the food help in this country is for children, and then you add to that another 17% are for senior citizens and the disabled, and you put that together, you find that this amendment would be insufficient to even cover those individuals alone, let alone the other 37% of men and women who get help right now. Unfortunately, block granting this program would not only, and capping it and cutting it, would not only hurt families who are counting on us for temporary help, but it would create a situation where we couldn't respond during an economic recession like we can right now. Again, crop insurance, we respond. There's a disaster, cost, spending goes up. I support that. But in this area, if we are capping and block granting and sending it back to the states, there would be no ability to be able to do that. The other thing that I think is absolutely true for many of our states, and certainly, unfortunately, I regret to say in my own state right now, is a fact, is that by block granting and not requiring that the dollars be used for food assistance for families, there is no guarantee that would go to food assistance. None. When we look at the pressures on budgets in other areas for critical needs and or things that people feel are important, we have absolutely no guarantee that this would go to food for families. We have a very efficient program right now. It's got one of the best error rates of any federal program right now, maybe the lowest. And we are able to efficiently support families and do it in a way that guarantees they actually get the nutritious food that they need. So I am deeply concerned about the amendment. I do not support it. I think it takes us in exactly the wrong direction as a country. It leaves a whole lot of families high and dry in an economic disaster or any kind of disaster that could occur for them when at their most vulnerable point, when they're trying to figure out what to do to get back on their feet, we create a situation where they don't even have enough food for their families to be able to feed them during their economic crisis. So I strongly urge colleagues to vote no on the amendment.
Senator Yield for a question.
I would be happy to.
Yeah, in listening to your comments and your opposition to this amendment, it occurred to me that do you see that there's anything wrong with the fact that this program has increased by 100% in the last 4 years in the cost? And secondly, do you find it nothing objectionable about projecting this for another 4 years to be another 100% increase in costs?
Well, first, to my friend from Oklahoma, I would say that the Budget Office has indicated it will not only not go up another 100%, it's going down. So they've projected about $11.5 billion reduction that we've put into our farm bill. It's going down because the economy is getting better. We do know that in food assistance, as the unemployment rate goes up, one of the lagging indicators, the things that aren't affected as quickly in coming down, is food assistance for families. So it's now coming down. In my judgment, it's coming down the way it should come down, which is the fact that people are going back to work. That's why it's coming down. And again, to just arbitrarily cap something as basic as food going on the table for a family is something that I just, with all due respect, can't.
Yes, and I would only ask one last question. The fact that you believe that it's going to be going down, it did not go down when the unemployment rate went down between the 2 years of 2010 and 2011. What would be different about this time?
Here's what we are finding, and it's not my belief, it's the CBO scoring. So the budget office that we rely on, objective scoring, not my judgment, is telling us it's going down. You're correct. It's slow to go down. As the unemployment goes down, it takes a little longer before food help goes down, because we do provide some help to people as they're getting back to work, even if they're not at full speed yet back to work. So it does go down more slowly, but they have projected over the next 10 years that, in fact, the spending on food assistance is going down because the economy is getting better. And that comes from the CBO and is built into the dollars that we have.
Sure. Well, one last question. Even though I disagree with your answer to the second question, the first question was, do you find it to be objectionable that increased by 100% over the past 4 years from 2008?
What I find objectionable is so many people lost their jobs, because the reason that went up is that people were out of work. And so I find that objectionable because a lot of those folks were in my state. And so I've worked very hard to do everything I can to support the private sector, and we're seeing the good news is manufacturing's coming back, and agriculture is strong and moving forward. And so in my judgment, yes, I find it very concerning that more people needed help putting food on their table. The good news is that less of them are going to in the next decade, and that's because people are going to be getting back to work. I believe our time, I believe, is this point is expired. I don't know if we have others that wish to speak at this point. I would ask for the yeas and nays, Madam President, on the amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown. Sorry, Mr. Evans. Sessions. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Burr, Coburn, Crapo, Grassley, Inhofe, Johans, McConnell, and Sessions. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Brown, Casey, Cochran, Collins, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Johnson of South Dakota, Leahy, McCaskill, Merkley, Pryor, Stabenow, and Warner. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no.
Ms. Blunt votes yes.
Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, no. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Yes, sir, I do. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye.
The way you want it, no lacrosse, no. You want me to wait? Yeah. You want me to wait? They told me they were gonna, but they told me you were okay with
Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Cowan, no.
be a no.
Mr. Corker, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their votes?
Mr. Roberts, no.
Are there any other senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 36, the nays are 60. The amendment is not agreed to. Without objection. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Michigan.
I would ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be considered and agreed to.
Senate is in a quorum call.
Oh, I would ask suspension of the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be considered and agreed to: Franken 992 and Vitter 1056.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you.
Madam President.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I rise to speak briefly about the Senate budget, and at the close of my comments, I'll make yet another motion to put the Senate budget into conference with the House. As we all know, we were here till 5 in the morning on the 23rd of March to pass the first Senate budget through regular budgetary order in 4 years. It was a full, open process, both in committee with numerous amendments and then on the floor with over 100 amendments voted on and over 70 passed. It is now past time, many days past time, for us to begin a budget conference process. This will enable the Senate to return to normal budgetary order, and it is what our voters, both Democratic and Republican, in all of our states expect us to do, to have a meaningful conference about this budget with the House. Good news, we're seeing some recent examples of normal order and compromise in this body that I think are worthy of some attention. The appropriations bill that we passed through a regular order process for the remainder of 2013 in March, the marketplace fairness bill that we passed, a problem that had been searching for a solution for 15 to 20 years, the WRDA bill that we passed last week, the debates that we're having about the Farm Bill today, all have involved significant open processes in a committee, significant open processes here on the floor, Senate action that then moves in a regular order into discussion with the House. And I think it is up to this body to show the public that we don't just embrace regular order and normal processes on these important issues, but that we also embrace them on something as critically important as the federal budget. And so for that reason, Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar item 33, which is H-Con Res 25, that the amendment which is on the desk, the text of the Senate Resolution 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 as amended be agreed to, that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist upon its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and that the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, and that following the authorization, two motions to instruct conferees be in order. First, a motion to instruct relative to the debt limit, and second, a motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue. That there be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to votes in relations to those two motions, and further, that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate. I make that motion, Madam President.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Madam President, thank you. And reserving the right to object, I would ask the senator from Virginia if he would consider adding or asking consent that the senator, I'd ask consent that the senator modify his request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit. And the reason why I make that is as follows. First of all, I do respect regular order tremendously, and in fact, I want to take this brief opportunity to congratulate the Judiciary Committee on the lengthy process with regard to the immigration bill, which I think will help us in the process of having a better product. And obviously, I'm also, although we disagree with the outcome because of the way it was constructed, also disagree with the way this budget is constructed. But this issue of the debt limit is an extraordinary measure, and that's why I would ask the senator from Virginia to modify his request.
Does the senator so modify his request?
I do not agree to the modification because I think that would be modifying the budget that was passed by this body on March 23rd.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Is there objection to the original request?
Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President, I rise again to regret that the normal, regular order of this body, after both sides of the Capitol have agreed on a budget, is to meet and that we have a proper process to instruct conferees to have a budget, a motion to appoint conferees to be bound by a requirement, no matter how worthy it is not the way the regular order functions in this body, and that's a fact. For 4 years, I sat here and beat up on the Majority Leader for his failure to bring a budget to the floor of this Senate. We brought a budget to the floor. We spent many, many hours on all kinds of amendments, and now we can't go to conference unless we agree not to raise the debt limit. Does my colleague from Florida believe that the House of Representatives, dominated by Republicans, are going to raise the debt limit? Does my colleague from Florida believe that any conferees that are appointed, we have to place certain restrictions on those conferees that would apply to the other body as well? I don't think so. I don't think that's the way that this body is supposed to function. We're in a gridlock. Here we are, 4 years without a budget. We finally get a budget. We stay up all night, and because somebody doesn't want to raise the debt limit, we are not going to go to conference. That's not how this body should function. The American people deserve better. They deserve a budget. Every family in America has to live on a budget. And here we are objecting because there is a concern about raising the debt limit. So all I can say to my friend from Florida is that the American people don't like it, and I don't like it. And most of his colleagues and the Republicans here in the Senate don't like it, that we are blocking from budget conferees from going forward and doing what conferees are supposed to do. So I would imagine that the Majority Leader will continue to raise this motion to move forward. And by the way, it is the regular order to have motions to instruct the conferees. A motion to instruct the conferees on the debt limit should be in order. A motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue should be in order. That's the regular order to do it. It is not the regular order to demand certain conditions on the conferees. We instruct the conferees. The conferees are appointed by both majority and Republican leader, and we placed our confidence in those conferees to reflect the will of the majority. And so I have to say I am disappointed in the senator from Florida and his objection and his demand that we do something that is not in the regular order. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you, Madam President. And to the senator from Arizona, for whom I have great respect, I would point out two things. The first is in your argument. You've stated that this issue of the debt limit is a non-issue. Hence, I don't understand the objection to having language in this motion that says that there won't be a raising of the debt limit. There should be a discussion of the debt limit in the context of the broader issues that this country is facing. And as a result, I don't understand why we can't just put it in that we're not going to raise the debt limit. I would also further say that I do respect this institution tremendously, and I do believe in regular order to the extent that we're talking about procedure. The problem is that the regular order of Washington has given us a $17 trillion debt. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I ran for the U.S. Senate. And I would submit to you, with all due respect to all of my colleagues who serve here, I don't think you can run up a $17 trillion debt without some bipartisan cooperation. So in some extent, what I am concerned about is the regular order of doing things in this city, where the debt limit has been raised consistently without any conversation about the fact that this government borrows 40 cents out of every dollar that it spends. 40 cents out of every dollar. Never in the history of this country and of this republic has a generation of leadership robbed a future generation like this generation of leadership has done. So that is my concern. My concern is I do not have trust in Washington, D.C., and I do not have trust, I don't care who's in charge, that we will not recklessly once again raise the limit of the greatest country on earth without any consideration for limiting the way we spend money in the future so that we do not bankrupt this extraordinary nation and the implications that could have on our children. Thank you, Madam
President.
Senator from Arizona.
I'll yield to the senator from Tennessee in just 1 second. So what the senator from Florida is saying, that if he has an issue that he feels strongly about, then that has to be included in any conference that is convened over any bill that is passed by the Senate and the House and goes to conference. That is not a precedent that is, I believe, should be established here in the United States Senate. Maybe I think I share the senator from Florida's concern about the debt and the deficit. I'll match my record against anybody's as far as trying to eliminate the debt and the deficit, including that of the senator of Florida. But now we are about to establish a precedent that if any conferees are appointed on bills that are passed by the House and the Senate, that we are free then to put certain restrictions on those conferees. If the senator from Florida believes that's the right way this body should function, then I would suggest to him that most people would disagree with this kind of violation of the regular order. Madam.
The senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I am reluctant to break up this conversation among my fellow Republican senators here because they seem to be at odds, but I do want to remind all of the senators, and I think the senator from Arizona has alluded to this, we were slapped around unmercifully for not passing a budget resolution.
And deservedly so.
I expected that. And I would say to the senator from Arizona, there were answers, and we had, I thought, good answers, but not good enough. We passed the budget resolution. You were here. It passed by one vote. We stayed until early in the morning hours to get it done. Senator Patty Murray did a masterful job in putting this together. But of course, our passing a resolution is only half the story. The way this is supposed to work, the so-called regular order, is if it differs between the Senate and the House, we come together in a conference to work out differences. How long have we been trying? How many weeks have we been trying? 61 days. 61 days. We have been begging the Republicans, not all of them, we've been begging the Republicans to give us an opportunity to go to conference and work out our differences if we can. That is the regular order of things. And each time we've asked, as Senator Kaine of Virginia did this morning, each time that we've asked, there's been a condition to it. No, you can't sit down and try to work out your differences unless you agree ahead of time to take certain things off the table. That is just not reasonable. It's not reasonable if you're serious about the deficit, if you're serious about the debt of the United States. I could dream up a half a dozen things. All right, I won't allow us to go to conference if it in any way is going to touch Social Security benefits. All right? I think I need a lot of support for that, and we wouldn't go to conference. But at the end of the day, if we're serious about the deficit, we're supposed to sit down and work out our differences, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans. And when Senator Kaine makes this unanimous consent request to go to a conference committee, he is asking for the regular order of business around here.
And could I ask my friend from Illinois, isn't that what the regular order is? It makes it perfectly applicable if we instruct the conferees, which is what we are asking for in this unanimous consent agreement.
Yes, and what the majority leader is on the floor, and he has said if there is to be a motion to instruct conferees on debt ceiling, for example, then we can have a vote on the floor of the Senate. That is the regular order of things.
Madam President.
But to condition the granting of unanimous consent to go to conference on whichever senator comes to the floor, his concern du jour is unproductive.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I haven't yielded the floor yet, and I think the senator from Texas had a question for me.
I thank my friend from Illinois, and I would ask my friend from Illinois that if the position that you are championing is the regular order, then why is it that the Democrats are asking unanimous consent to set aside the regular order and to go to conference? The only reason unanimous consent is needed is because you are endeavoring to circumvent the regular order, and by doing so, opening the door for a procedural trick to raise the debt ceiling with 50 votes rather than 60.
Well, I just checked with the majority leader to make sure my memory was correct on this. The senator from Texas will learn that when we go to a conference committee, we are subjected to a possibility of a filibuster. Does that ring a note of familiarity on your side of the aisle? And if we are going to face a filibuster in 60 votes, it's not going to happen. So what we're trying to do is to establish ahead of time we're going to a conference. So if we go through the so-called regular order to conference, we'll reach the same impasse with the Republicans objecting and the Republicans potentially raising the issue of a filibuster. That's why we are trying for this unanimous consent, which I would think from the Republican side, that we would have a bipartisan agreement that we move to a conference.
Will the senator yield for another question?
I'm sorry. I'm mistaken, and thankfully I've been corrected. It is not a filibuster. but it would call for using the House resolution, 50 hours of debate, and another vote-a-rama to go through the regular order of things. It is not a filibuster. I stand corrected on that. But the net result of it is to drag out as long, if not longer, than the earlier debate on the Senate budget resolution. That's why the